You can't even clean a floor correctly, Cross. No wonder they took your dog and gave you a mop. Stay in the gutters where you belong.
They've taken my brother, and the agency has turned its back on me. If you bring him back alive, Gideon...
In the iron-clad hierarchy of the military, there are those who command from the light and those who are buried in the shadows of their past. Colonel Valentina Sterling is the golden girl of the Aegis Strike Force, a woman who breathes power and demands perfection. To her, Gideon Cross is a stain on the base's reputation, a man who lost his unit, his dog, and his dignity, now reduced to cleaning kennels and hauling trash. She treats him as a ghost, a reminder of failure. But when a shadow falls over Valentina's own family and her elite team fails her, the only person left standing in the rain is the man she tried to wash away. In a world where rank is everything, a desperate promise is about to bridge the gap between a queen and a... The morning sun hit the asphalt of the Aegis Strike Force headquarters with a punishing clinical glare that revealed every crack in the pavement. Within the high-security walls, the air smelled of jet fuel and the metallic tang of heavy weaponry. It was a place built for heroes, where every shadow was meant to be hunted. Gideon Cross moved through this world of iron and ego like a ghost, unnoticed by the soldiers who marched past him. Gideon pushed a heavy industrial mop across the polished marble of the main rotunda with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The rhythmic swish of the gray water was the only sound he allowed himself to make in this temple of power. His olive-drab coveralls were heavily stained with bleach and the dark mud of the outdoor kennels. He felt the weight of the brass-based sanitation badge pinned to his chest, a heavy reminder of how far he had fallen. His coal-black hair was messy and damp from the humid morning air, clinging to his forehead in jagged streaks. The burn scar along his right jawline felt tight, a physical map of the mission that had cost him everything. He kept his dark, haunted eyes focused strictly on the floor, avoiding the judgmental stares of the passing officers. He was no longer a legendary handler, just the man who cleaned up after the dogs. High-gloss jump boots clicked sharply against the marble, a sound that signaled the arrival of the elite morning patrol. Colonel Valentina Sterling led the group with a stride that demanded the air itself move out of her way. Her black tactical uniform was perfectly tailored, emphasizing her poised and commanding silhouette. Her raven hair was pulled back into a high ponytail, so tight it seemed to sharpen the aristocratic lines of her face. Valentina stopped abruptly, her sapphire eyes catching a single, shimmering streak of dampness Gideon had yet to dry. The elite squad behind her came to a synchronized halt, their eyes locking onto the back of the janitor. The air in the rotunda became thin and heavy with a sudden, suffocating tension. Valentina did not look at Gideon's face, but instead stared down at the imperfect floor with visible disgust.
She pointed a gloved finger at the water spot, her voice cutting through the silence like a serrated blade. She asked him if the filth of the kennels had finally clouded his vision to the point of incompetence. Gideon did not look up, his posture remaining stoic as he held the wooden handle of his mop. He felt the heat of a dozen mocking gazes burning into his back as he waited for her next words.
Valentina stepped closer until the tips of her polished boots touched the edge of his gray cleaning bucket. She spoke loudly enough for the young recruits in the back to hear every stinging syllable. She called him a disgrace to the uniform he used to wear and a burden on the base's resources. To her, he was nothing more than the waste he spent his days collecting from the canine cages. The colonel's voice rose as she described how a man who failed his unit deserved to live in the gutters. She mocked the way he clung to a silence, calling it the cowardice of a man with no defense. Gideon's knuckles turned white as he gripped the mop, but he did not offer a single word of protest. He accepted the public humiliation as if it were a natural part of his penance. A few of the younger officers let out hushed, cruel chuckles at the sight of the former hero being dismantled. They whispered about the legendary Gideon Cross, who was now afraid of a woman's shadow. Valentina leaned in, her cold breath hitting his ear as she told him to stay in the dirt where you belong. She warned him that if she saw another streak on her floor, she would have him barred from the base entirely. She turned on her heel with a sharp crack of leather, signaling her team to continue their march toward the briefing room. The squad followed her, several of them intentionally stepping through the wet patch Gideon had been trying to dry. He watched the muddy boot prints mar the surface he had spent an hour polishing. He did not sigh or curse, but simply began to move the mop again. The rotunda returned to its usual hum of activity, leaving Gideon with the scent of bleach and his own memories. He worked with a precision that belied his lowly status, his mind a steel trap of tactical observations. He noticed the slight tremor in the colonel's hand as she walked away, a sign of stress she couldn't hide. He knew the pressure of command better than anyone currently walking those halls. Just as Gideon reached the edge of the rotunda, the red emergency lights began to flash with a violent, rhythmic pulse. A high-pitched alarm wailed through the building, a sound that signaled a catastrophic breach of national security. Doors slammed open, and the sound of panicked shouting echoed from the command levels above. Gideon stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the coming storm. The rain lashed against the metal siding of the base kennels like 1,000 tiny hammers. Thunder rolled across the shipyard, drowning the frantic sounds of the base in lockdown. Valentina stumbled through the mud, her pristine black uniform now soaked and splattered with gray sludge. Her raven hair had come loose from its ponytail, clinging to her neck in wet, tangled strands. The golden Aegis insignia on her collar caught the strobe-like flashes of lightning. Her hands were shaking so violently, she had to grip her elbows to stay upright. The news from the command center had been a death sentence for her career and her family. Her brother was in the hands of the very monsters she had claimed to have eliminated. The Pentagon had already initiated the process to strip her of command for criminal negligence. She was no longer the queen of the strike force, but a woman with a target on her back. She saw a lone figure standing in the shadows of the kennel entrance, silhouetted by a flickering security light. Gideon Cross stood there, his olive-drab coveralls dark with rain, looking out at the storm with an eerie calmness. He did not move as she approached, his stoic face a mask of iron in the darkness. The industrial mop was gone, replaced by a heavy coil of climbing rope hanging from his shoulder. He looked less like a janitor and more like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Valentina collapsed to her knees in the thick mud just feet away from his boots. The icy water soaked through her tactical pants, but she did not seem to feel the cold. She looked up at him, her sapphire eyes wide with a terror he had never seen in her before. Her voice was hoarse, broken by the weight of her desperation as she called his name. She begged him to listen to her before the military police arrived to take her away. She told him that her superiors had known about the cell all along. They had let the extraction fail to hide their own corruption and used her as the scapegoat. Now her brother was paying the price for a game of political chess she could not win. She had no team left, no rank to hide behind, and no allies in the halls of power. Gideon remained silent, his dark eyes studying her face with a terrifying intensity. "I have nothing left to give but myself," she cried out over the roar of the wind. She reached out and grabbed the rough fabric of his wet coveralls with trembling fingers. "If you bring my brother back alive, Gideon, I will marry you. I will leave the Aegis Strike Force and stand by your side forever. I will give you my name, my status, and every ounce of my loyalty if you save him." Gideon looked down at her, the rain dripping from the jagged burn scar on his jaw. He did not laugh or mock her for the absurdity of her offer. Instead, he reached down and gripped her wrists, his hands like iron bands against her skin. He pulled her to her feet with a strength that did not belong to a simple waste collector. For the first time, the haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a cold, predatory focus. "I don't want your rank or your status, Valentina," he said, his voice deep and steady against the storm. He wiped a streak of mud from her cheek with his thumb, his gaze never wavering from hers. "I will save him because it is the right thing to do, not because of a promise made in fear. But if you stand with me, you stand with a man the world wants to forget. Do you understand what you are asking of me tonight?"
She nodded frantically, her tears mixing with the rainwater streaming down her face. Gideon turned toward a heavy steel locker hidden behind a stack of empty canine crates. He pulled a concealed latch, and the back of the locker swung open to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay a high-tech tactical vest, a suppressed sidearm, and a customized communications array. The janitor was gone, and the legendary operator was emerging from the shadows.
He began to strip off the stained, olive-drab coveralls, revealing a body mapped with scars of a dozen forgotten wars. He moved with a lethal efficiency that made Valentina's breath hitch in her chest. He checked the magazine of the sidearm with a metallic click that sounded like a promise of death. He told her to go to the secondary comms room and wait for his signal. He had friends in the underworld who still owed him their lives. Gideon slung the tactical pack over his shoulders and secured the suppressed pistol to his thigh. He looked at the storm one last time, calculating the wind speed and the visibility for the mountain trek. The insurgents would be expecting a full military response, not a single ghost in the night. He checked the digital map on his wrist, the blue light reflecting in his dark, intense eyes. He was already moving toward the perimeter fence before she could say another word. Valentina watched him disappear into the blackness of the shipyard, a shadow among shadows. She felt a strange surge of hope that she had not felt in years. However, the sound of sirens began to wail closer, and the headlights of 3 black SUVs appeared at the base gate. The agency's internal affairs team had arrived to arrest her for treason. She stood her ground in the rain, knowing her life was now entirely in the hands of the man she had once called trash. The fluorescent lights of the high-security hearing room hummed with a cold electric tension. Heavy oak doors stood guarded by soldiers in dress blues, their faces set in stone. Valentina sat at the center table, her hands cuffed in front of her. The gold braid on her uniform had been ripped away, leaving loose threads on her shoulders. She stared at the clock, counting every second since Gideon had vanished into the rain. General Vance slammed a thick folder onto the podium, his face reddened by a mask of manufactured outrage. He declared that Valentina Sterling was a traitor who had sold national secrets to the enemy. The other officers in the room murmured in agreement, their eyes filled with judgment and hidden satisfaction. Valentina did not speak, her gaze fixed on the heavy doors at the back of the hall. She remembered the warmth of Gideon's grip in the mud of the shipyard. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed from the hallway, silencing the general's tirade. The doors swung open with a violent force that shook the frames. A man walked in, but he was not the janitor they all remembered. He wore a dark, tactical combat suit that clung to his powerful frame like a second skin. His face was streaked with ash and dried blood, making the burn scar on his jaw glow white. Gideon Cross did not stop until he reached the center of the room, standing directly beside Valentina. He carried a heavy reinforced data drive and a blood-stained tactical radio in his gloved hands. Behind him, a young man stumbled into the room, looking pale but unharmed. Valentina let out a strangled sob as she recognized her brother's face. The guards moved to intercept Gideon, but he leveled a stare that froze them in their tracks. He tossed the data drive onto the general's podium with a loud, metallic clatter. The drive contained the audio recordings of the general's secret deals with the insurgent cell. Gideon's voice was like gravel as he told them the game was over. He explained how he had dismantled the entire compound and rescued the hostage in less than 6 hours. The legendary operative they had tried to bury had just saved the agency from its own rot. General Vance reached for his sidearm, but his hand stopped midair as he saw the red laser dots on his chest. Gideon's old canine unit, now led by loyalists, appeared at every entrance with their weapons drawn. They were not there to arrest Valentina, but to protect the man who had trained them. The high-ranking officers in the room began to pale, realizing their power had vanished. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Gideon's undeniable victory. Valentina's brother rushed forward and threw his arms around her, shaking with relief. She held him tightly, her tears falling onto his bruised shoulder as the handcuffs were finally removed. She looked up at Gideon, her sapphire eyes filled with a shock that was slowly turning into profound awe. He stood like a pillar of granite, his expression softening only when his eyes met hers. He had not just saved her brother, he had restored the honor she thought was lost. Gideon reached out and gently pulled her to her feet, his touch firm and grounding. He did not say a word, but the intensity of his gaze spoke of a devotion that transcended rank. Valentina felt her heart melt as she realized the depth of the sacrifice he had made. She reached up and touched the jagged scar on his jaw, her fingers tracing the map of his pain. She knew in that moment that she would never go back to the world of cold ambition. The young recruits who had mocked Gideon in the rotunda now stood at attention, their heads bowed in shame. They could not even look at the man they had called a trash collector just a day before. The room was filled with the sound of their heavy breathing and the quiet clicking of the data drive being accessed. Valentina looked at them and then back at Gideon, her voice steady and clear. She told them that they were not fit to stand in the shadow of a true hero. "I am resigning my commission effective immediately," Valentina announced to the stunned assembly. She began to unbutton her black tactical jacket, letting it fall to the floor in a heap of useless fabric. She chose the man who had stood by her when everyone else had fled into the shadows. She took Gideon's hand, her fingers interlaced with his rough, calloused palm. The elite colonel was gone, and only the woman who loved him remained. Gideon pulled her closer until there was no space left between them in the crowded room. He promised her that they would build a life far away from the lies and the gray walls of the base. "I will keep my word," Valentina whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. "I will marry you in the morning, and I will be proud to carry your name." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture of protection and deep, silent respect. They walked out of the hearing room together, their footsteps echoing with a new, unified strength. The sunlight outside was bright and clean, washing away the remnants of the storm. Gideon led her toward the old Jeep parked near the kennels, where his gear was already packed. They did not look back at the building that had once defined their lives. They drove toward the horizon, two ghosts finally stepping into the light of a new beginning.